After the fall of the Roman Empire, society fell into chaos, as there was no single leader in Europe to rule. People looked to their local leaders for protection, and these leaders began to control vast areas of land. Eventually, they became known as kings, and they organized society. This system became known as the Feudal System. On top was the king, who owned the land and made laws. He gave some land to the lords and nobles, who agreed to supply the king with soldiers. The lords and vassals gave some of their land to their own soldiers, known as knights, who fought for their nobles and the king. At the bottom of the feudal system were the peasants, who worked the land in return for protection. Peasants were split into serfs and freemen. Freemen paid a rent to their lord, and they also paid a tithe to their local priest, which was 10% of their income. They were paid, could marry, and could leave the manor. Serfs were essentially slaves and had to work for free. In return for their work, the lord would often give them a small plot of land to farm on. They could not leave nor marry without permission from the lord. If the serf managed to escape for a year and a day, he was then a free man. Towns were few and far between, and most people lived their whole lives in their small manor in the countryside. The manor usually had up to 50 houses, with a manor house for the lord or knight and a church. There was usually a mill, a ford, and a house for the bailiff, the man who ran the manor when the lord was not there. He also collected taxes and kept law and order. Farming was the main job for most people at the time. The land that was farmed was divided into 3 fields, with each field being divided between the different tenant families. Crop rotation was used, whereby crops planted in each field were changed each year, and one field was left fallow so that it could recover its nutrients. There was often a 4th field where animals could graze. The diet of the people consisted of bread, cheese, vegetables, soup, and ale. Water was rarely drank as it was not safe to drink. Serfs only ate meat at Christmas or Easter. Sunday was the only day that serfs had off. Serfs lived in wattle and daub homes, while lords and knights lived in castles. When a lord received his land for the first time, he had a temporary castle built called a motte and bailey. It was an artificial hill with a wooden tower on top. Below the hill there was an enclosed area where the soldiers lived, and it was surrounded with a moat. Once control was exerted by the lord, he had a permanent stone castle built. These castles took years to build, and each castle generally had similar key parts. Curtain walls to enclose the castle and protect the inside, a keep which held the bedrooms, a great hall and chapel, dungeons, battlements, a bailey where the soldiers' lodgings were kept, a gatehouse with a drawbridge and portcullis, and finally a moat surrounding the castle. Because war was so common, castles were a key defence mechanism for the lord and his lands. The high walls and highly trained soldiers made them a difficult target. Attacking a castle head-on could be time-consuming, so new attack methods were made, such as catapults and siege towers. Gunpowder arrived in Europe from China in the 1400s, and the cannon was soon invented. The medieval lord was powerful. He had large amounts of land and plenty of soldiers. Marriages were used for political means. The lady's family would pay the lord a dowry, and the lady would usually marry young. The woman's role at this time was to bear children, care for their children, and manage the household. They wore full-length dresses. The man's role was to maintain order, exact judgment, and train soldiers. Men wore long tunics and trousers. Vivid clothing showed off the wearer's wealth. Soon silk was brought over from Asia and became popular amongst the nobility. Entertainment was just as important as war. For fun, men would hunt and hold tournaments. which would feature mock battles and jousting. Huge feasts were held by the lord, and meat would be served. Minstrels played music, and jesters provided comical relief. In medieval Ireland, there were three main types of soldier. Foot soldiers fought with swords, daggers and spears, and had shields. They were peasants and returned to work once the battle or war was over. Archers fought with a bow and arrow, and knights fought on horseback and wore full body armour. Knights were minor nobles, and it took many years for them to become a knight. There was a 3-stage process for a person to become a knight. Stage 1 involved a boy of 7 years being fostered to a family of another lord. He would learn his basic skills such as riding a horse and using a sword. Once he turned 14, he would become a squire. He would accompany the lord to battle and help the lord to dress for battle. At 21, if he had proven himself, he would become a knight. The night before his knighting ceremony, he would spend time in the chapel. The next day, he would wear a white robe and full armour, and he would swear an oath of chivalry to the lord. The lord would place his sword on each of the man's shoulders and knight him. In medieval times, there were towns. Most towns were built on rivers or by the coast. The king would write a charter for each town, which was a contract that allowed the town freedom to run their own affairs so long as they paid taxes to the king. A mayor ran the town. Most towns had high walls and stone gates to provide protection. There was a high street with a market square in the centre and a church. There was also a fair green for the annual fair. The average person's house was made from wood and stood several stories high. Craftsmen had their shops on the ground floor, with their family living above the shop. Most houses had back gardens where people would grow vegetables and keep animals. People would throw their waste out of their windows, which would make the streets stink. Because the houses were made from wood, there was a high risk of houses catching on fire. For this reason, curfews were imposed, which meant people had to extinguish their fires at dusk. As more people began to perform the same trade, guilds were formed. Guilds charged a fee for membership and set the standards of quality of members' work, set wages, and cared for old or sick members as well as their families. Most boys took up their father's trade and became an apprentice. They would live with a master craftsman and would work with them, often in harsh conditions for no pay, for 7 years. Once that time had elapsed, they became journeymen and would get paid for their work. Eventually, once they had accrued enough training, they became a master craftsman and had to create a masterpiece in order to obtain that title. Medicine during the Middle Ages was not very good. In fact, it could often worsen a person's condition rather than cure them. People did not understand the body and believed that it was made up of 4 humours: blood, black bile, yellow bile and phlegm. Most treatments at the time were cupping, bleeding, leeching and amputation. Cupping involved heated metal cups being placed on the skin to draw fluids to the surface. Herbal medicine was also used, and monasteries became specialised in caring for the sick and became the first hospitals. Diseases and infection were widespread. A minor wound could be fatal, and there were no vaccines. People's immune systems were not able to fight off infection very well, and many children died before the age of 2. Women also faced the added danger of childbirth. Midwives and doctors usually had no training in childbirth, except for witnessing previous births. Women could lose a lot of blood during birth, and they could also get infection from the birth, often dying as a result. One of the worst diseases to affect Europe in the Middle Ages was the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague. It arrived in Europe around 1346 via rats carrying fleas on ships. It peaked between 1347 and 1350 and claimed the lives of almost 50% of the European population. It was extremely contagious and spread by air. It caused oozing swellings all over the body, discoloured skin, and filled the lungs with phlegm. Once infected, people had almost no chance of surviving. At the time, people believed that cats were demonic, and they killed many of the cats. They had allowed cats to live. Those cats would have killed many of the rats that caused disease, and not as many people would have contracted the disease and died. No one knew what caused the Black Death at the time. Many people believed it was because they had angered God or blamed other groups. As a result of the Black Death, the feudal system went into decline, with many serfs leaving their manor for other manors, and doctors began to question their practices, which would lead to big changes in medicine in the Renaissance period. The main law system in place in medieval Ireland before the Normans arrived was Brehon law. Under Brehon law, women had greater freedom and independence than women in other European societies. Both men and women could have property, and divorce was legal. While the Vikings settled in Ireland, they also settled in France in an area known as Normandy. The people who lived there became known as Norman. This region became one of the most powerful in Europe in the Middle Ages. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, invaded England and became the king. Over a century later, in 1167, the King of Leinster, Dermot MacMurrough, was stripped of his kingship by Rory O'Connor, the High King of Ireland, and MacMurrough travelled to England. He asked the English king Henry II for help to take back his lands. He offered to become Henry's vassal in return for help. Henry allowed MacMurrough to recruit soldiers from the Norman lords. MacMurrough made a deal with Richard de Clare, also known as Strongbow, for a Norman army. In return, Strongbow would marry MacMurrough's daughter Aoife and become King of Leinster upon MacMurrough's death. In 1169, MacMurrough invaded Ireland with a huge army, defeated the Vikings in Wexford, and the following year Strongbow arrived with an even larger army. He and MacMurrough combined their armies and took control of Dublin. In 1171, MacMurrough died and Strongbow became the King of Leinster. Henry II feared Strongbow was becoming too powerful and invaded Ireland with 4,000 soldiers. He wanted to become the ruler of Ireland and wanted to control the Normans, Vikings and Gaelic Irish. By this point, the Normans had begun to take control of much of Ireland, and many of the Irish kings swore allegiance to Henry as they hoped that this would stop the Norman expansion. Henry bestowed himself the title of Lord of Ireland. The Norman conquest of Ireland had a huge impact on Ireland that would last for centuries. The feudal system was created, big castles were built, many of which are still standing today. Towns and villages grew, and farming developed further. English common law replaced Brehon law, and Norman names became common. Finally, the English would rule Ireland for nearly 800 years.